how can women of faith challenge those who misuse religious scriptures to cause harm?
Sure thing. What a question, everybody. I'll just repeat it for everybody else watching at home, because I'm just conscious that we as the three speakers have seen these questions, and we've got to live with them for a little while and to reflect on them, and you're just hearing them as a line straight away and having to pick it up at this very late hour. So how can we as women of faith challenge those who misuse religious scriptures to cause harm? So I first wrote down, when I was thinking about this, I wrote down, our theological views have consequences. And in terms of challenging anybody who misuse religious scriptures to cause harm, or even just use religious scriptures to cause harm, they don't even have to be misusing them. There are some religious scriptures, certainly in the Bible, that I'm not very proud of, and I wish they weren't there as a woman, to be honest. So I don't think people have even had to really misuse religious scriptures to cause harm. I think it is perfectly possible to cause harm by just using religious scriptures. So first of all, I would like to say that our theological views have consequences. And I do think it's easier to challenge those who misuse scriptures to cause harm intentionally. I find it more difficult personally to challenge those who misuse scriptures and cause harm and have seemingly no idea of the consequences of their interpretations or use of texts. So there are some people in the church, for example, who believe women should not be ordained, that women should stay silent in church. And I can see how they can interpret that from the scriptures. But they don't seem to understand what the consequences of that is, on how that would feel as women to be told that you are inferior and you are less than. And I think that has consequences for the kind of God you're also being invited to worship, but I'll come to that. I think that you can earnestly believe a literal piece of the Bible from scripture from nearly 2,000 years ago and apply it to this cultural context, and do that from a position of seeking to be faithful to God and to scripture. I know lots and lots of people who are really sincere and devout in their views and who are applying scripture and don't mean to cause harm, but they're now in a different cultural context. But I also think they can be completely unaware or uninterested in the idea that some of their theological views have got what I call violent consequences. So I'm thinking about violence. It's because I'm studying violence in relation to gender and interfaith for my PhD at the moment. But one of the founders of something called Peace Studies, a man called Johan Galtung, and he talks about violence in a really broad sense, about limiting life and how it causes harm and limiting the potential of people. So when we define violence in the broadest sense of causing harm or limiting life or potential, I think when someone holds fast to a literal translation or a particular theological interpretation that limits the freedom or equality of another, it's very, very difficult. I find that very, very difficult to stomach. Some use the Bible to say that women are in some way inferior to men, and I do get concerned about the logical next step of those views, because for me, as I said earlier, I would come to it. What does that say about a God who supposedly made all people in their image, but doesn't seem to like approximately half of them, or at least has a preference for certain ones of them, depending on their body parts? And for me, I find that really difficult to understand. I think these views can also cause real harm, but I don't expect those who hold those views to necessarily see that they're causing harm. And then the sociologist in me says, our theological convictions have violent consequences, and it's important to reflect on what upholds and feeds those views. So living in a patriarchal society in which grew up most of our patriarchal faiths, it can be a doubly powerful weight for women of faith. When you add to that the perception of the voice of God into the equation, it can be really crushing for women. So the kind of view where you say, God said this simplified thing, I believe it, so it's true, and you just can't question the voice of God, or you're seen as unfaithful to the Bible, which is, of course, a scripture that is open to interpretation and can, in fact, be used to justify all sorts of views. So a reminder of the question, how can we as women of faith challenge those who misuse religious scriptures to cause harm? I thought, is the question actually, how can we challenge? What form can that take? Then my answer would be, any way we like is how we can challenge those who would use the scriptures to cause harm. Some women show their anger and they rage at the repeated and systematic oppression of women of faith. And that's okay as a response and a way of challenge. Some women gently state their point, and that's okay too. Some women don't bother at all because sometimes those intent on harm can't be dissuaded from it, and that's okay as well. And some women don't challenge because to do so is a risk and is costly and can be isolating and exhausting. And of course, some women don't want to challenge because they themselves, in fact, have adopted those beliefs and don't consider themselves to be harmed, but instead to be functioning in roles or positions set out for them by God, which can be deemed by others to be inferior positions. So I would say, how can we as women of faith challenge those who would use scriptures to cause harm? There is no one way to be a woman of any faith.
Thoughts to chew over there. Yes, I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking how the women have such a strong role in living a life, a non-violent life, and how when we are violent, how it doesn't just affect the community, relationships, all those things, it connects, it actually affects nature. And that's something I'm quite interested in myself. So it's something that we have to, it's not a limited thing in the family or the community. It's a huge, huge subject. The whole world is in violence at the moment, isn't it? Anyhow, Lakshmi, it's a wonderful question.
Yes, I was just thinking, how am I going to react to this question? So, misusing scriptures. Actually, religious discrimination is a subtle form of cultural, religious, and even racial violence, which people are discriminated because of their religious beliefs, race and nationality, and subjected to social and economic disabilities. So, is it because of scriptures or is it because of the religion? Or, it's a big question mark, what causes the discrimination? You have to see from where the violence is coming. Is it coming from the scriptures? Is it, or from the interpretation of scriptures? Or is it coming from the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the human beings? It's very difficult, but I think all three are responsible for the religious violence, wars, bloodshed. Often it's caused by all these factors together. It's also difficult to speak objectively about the subject, especially if you are a religious person and committed to a particular religion. If you are a secular person, it is even more difficult. So how to react is really, really difficult. It's also true that violence is inherent in human nature, and human beings are easily swayed by emotions and irrational behavior. Many factors incite them into violent behavior, and religious attachment and loyalty happens to be one. Political and ideological differences may also lead to religious conflicts. Therefore, the problem of religious violence is a complex issue and should not be oversimplified with generalization. I would say that positive understanding and mutual respect to all religions can save the situation to a certain extent. I think a treaty was also signed in 2019 by His Holiness Pope and and at Abu Dhabi, which also states something like this. Its mutual respects can do a lot to help resolve this situation. Thank you.
That's really empowering. And I was thinking how we can hear so much of violence, and if we become, if you like, it becomes part of our life, doesn't it? Well and truly nowadays, much more.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we talk about compassion fatigue, which is often a phrase that's often used in the past, that how we, and you speak about the subtlety of violence and how, and Suzanne was sharing about the different areas of violence most eloquently. Perhaps, Jagbir, you could take us into your thoughts, please, on this question.
Coming from a Sikh perspective and thinking and reflecting on the Guru Granth Sahib, one of the things that I find very important and novel about and empowering about it is that it's very inclusive of other faiths. So it talks about religious worship in Islam. It talks about the Vedas. There's a quote which says, "Do not say the Vedas, the Bible, and the Quran are false. Those who do not contemplate their scriptures are the ones who are false." There are verses from religious saints from the other faith traditions. So there's a recognition of religious diversity and pluralism. There's also a recognition by the actions of some of the gurus in terms of how they reacted to, say, the Mughal emperors and the violence that they were inflicting on society at that time. And one of the things that I take away from that engagement, say, for example, Guru Nanak Dev Ji had with Babur, is that you have to stand up and you have to challenge and you have to raise your voice against injustice. So as a woman of faith, we will recognize difference and how that we are all special in our own and unique way, and that everyone has a role to play in the world. And as women, as mothers, as daughters, sisters, wives, we have an important role to play in terms of ensuring that future generations learn about the true faith, but also learn how they should live within society where they respect everyone. So with that in mind, there's also the recognition that as women of our faith, of faith, we know what's happening in our own communities, but also within, say, the wider communities, because we are so active in our places of worship, for example. So I'm just talking about in contemporary context. And you could see some of this reflected when COVID hit. It was the women, because they play such an important role in the place of worship. They would know who are the most vulnerable. They would know which family would need some extra support, etc., so that they could help facilitate that. So there's a very important role that we play, one for our own faith, but also for the faiths of other community in terms of respecting that diversity, but also protecting that diversity. And it's a challenge. It's not challenging. It's trying to strive to understand and accept diversity and to value the differences in others. I think that's very important that we do that. And I'm just straying away a little bit from that. How do we challenge those who misuse religious scriptures to cause harm? But I think it's that we have to understand and value the differences in others, but we also have to engage with others who are creating harm through misusing religious scripture. We have to build trust and destroy that concept of othering and the divisions based on religion, race, language, gender, and national boundaries. There's a quote from within the Guru Granth Sahib where when I reflect on the harms that the misuse of religious scriptures does, that within our Guru Granth Sahib, it talks about how I see no stranger, I see no enemy, I get along with everyone. Whoever God has created, I accept as good. So that's an important element. There's a need to challenge, but also to listen with humility and to be authentic. And when I'm saying be authentic, I'm not saying that you have to sideline your own faith. Actually, I think when I'm talking about authentic, that you have to recognize your own faith and respect it, but at the same time, be humble enough to recognize and celebrate that diversity and pluralism. And when there is that level, when we do see that misuse of religious scripture, which causes harm, we have to recognize that it's one of our duties to protect the other, right? And as a woman of faith, I think that's very important. And I think within that knowledge that we have to call out the misuse of scripture, I will draw on my own faith background, and there is a quote within the Guru Granth Sahib which says, if you have a bag of wisdom, philosophy, open it so that it can be shared by others. If your friends have good philosophy, adopt it. Only adopt good philosophy, leave the others which are not acceptable. And I think why I'm reflecting on that verse is that it talks about how when we see that misuse of say religious scripture, we have to be able to challenge it and to kind of sideline it, so that we only give a voice to that positive scripture. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed, very, very much. And a bag of wisdom, I might say, was there. And how we address those that misuse. I think it's really bad, isn't it, when we misuse scriptures in this way, any scripture. We're all one family too. But also I was thinking how all the scriptures have love thy neighbor, which as thyself. So, how would you engage? I was thinking, how do you engage with those who cause violence? It takes a strong faith, it takes courage, and it takes love, I think.
Jhutti, can I just jump in with one verse? Because what you just said reminded me of, there's a verse from which says, someone is Hindu and someone a Muslim, then someone is Shia and someone a Sunni. Recognize the whole of the human race as one, right? And that's not focusing on the misuse of scripture, but it's trying to kind of recognize, show people that there is that universality of humanity. We're all on that same one path. Yeah. But we've got, we're all aiming to unite with that one. But we've got different paths that we're taking to it. And we shouldn't disrespect those paths. Actually, we should respect them and be true to those paths. That's the important thing. Be true to that path that you're on.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good.